Chapter 8.
"You fool! Oh, you fool!"
Katie Rollins cried.
"You've ruined everything now."
Dusty Morgan's lips tightened. He held the lines lax and allowed the palominos to run off steam by plunging along at a fast lope. They left the little village of Hermosa behind swiftly, following the road in the shadow of the rim rocks southward with the river at their right. Katie sank back away from him on the seat. She folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. Stealing a sideways glance at her, Dusty saw a tear stealing down her tanned cheek. He jerked his gaze back and looked straight ahead. Tonelessly, he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, if I done wrong. It sounded to me like you was in trouble and I was only aiming to help." Katie didn't reply for a time. The spirited team began to slow down, and Dusty brought them into a high step and trot with a gentle pressure upon the lines.
"I am in trouble,"
Katie Rollins admitted after a long silence.
"I suppose you were trying to help out, but you picked the wrong way to do it."
He could see her and feel her eyes upon him, and he held himself from turning to meet their gaze.
It was my fault," the girl admitted honestly. "I shouldn't have said what I did about not wanting you because the KT needs a man."
"No," said Dusty. "I reckon you shouldn't have, lest you wanted it proved different."
"But how was I to know?" She hesitated. "Those clothes of yours."
"I reckon I did look kind of funny in Hermosa," Dusty agreed. "But what I want to know is how come I ruined things."
"By having a run-in with Lon Boxley. You humiliated him in front of his men and me. You've made a bitter enemy, and a dangerous one."
Dusty shrugged his shoulders indifferently. He had it coming to him.
"That's neither here nor there," she cried. "He's been my only friend since Dad died. Without his help, there wouldn't be any KT Ranch. And after what you did this morning, he'll kill you on sight if you stay around."
Something in her voice made Dusty turn and look at her. "You sound like you'd care," he marveled. She glanced away quickly, a telltale spot of crimson burning in her cheek.
"It means you can't stay and work on the KT even if I wanted to hire you," she told him primly. "A dead hand isn't good to me."
"Other men have tried to kill me," he told her.
"But Lon Boxley isn't other men. Did you notice the way he carries his gun?"
"Yeah, I noticed."
"There's no man in the Big Bend that can go up against his draw. It looks awkward, but it's dynamite."
"I've heard about men that carry their guns that way," Dusty told her carelessly. "Always hankered kind of to sort of see it in action." He felt her probing eyes on him again and turned to look to her. This time she didn't turn away. She studied his face for a moment and then shook her head helplessly.
"I don't understand you at all."
"Just put me down for a drifting waddy that don't like being pushed around."
"In those clothes?"
There was an impish sort of chuckle in her voice. Dusty looked down at himself and grinned. "I'll tell you about these clothes, ma'am. There was another fellow that, well, sort of kind of got into a little trouble on account of this outfit, and he wanted to get rid of it, so we traded. I aimed to get some more first town I come to, but I sort of kind of got hurried in Hermosa and done neglected it." Katie seemed to accept his explanation at face value.
"Even if you're not afraid of Lon, he'll never forgive me if I gave you a job, and no one man could replace the help he's given me."
"You got me plumb curious," Dusty said to her. What kind of trouble are you in, and what kind of help has Boxley given you?
I'm Katie Rollins. Since Dad died, I've been trying to run the ranch by myself.
Dusty nodded. I've heard of the KT spread, and I've been wondering whereabouts it lay. Riding into the Big Bend, I ain't seen no good cow country. Have you got a stock of breed that is trained to graze on greasewood? Katie laughed softly.
Just you wait. I'll show you a real ranch.
Her young voice throbbed with pride and then became wistful.
That is, it used to be. Right now I'm only half stocked and losing more cattle every day.
Rustlers? She nodded.
I couldn't believe it at first. Dad never had any trouble with rustlers, and when my hands wanted to start wearing guns, I wouldn't let them. I don't believe in bloodshed.
No man believes in it, Dusty told her shortly. It's something that has to be sometimes.
I'm beginning to realize that, Katie admitted unsteadily. But I wouldn't at first, and my hands began drifting away. They refused to stay and ride the range unarmed while my cattle were being rustled, and I think they resented having a girl for a boss.
Dusty looked at her evenly. That doesn't make sense. I'd think every man in the Big Bend would be horning in to ride with a boss as purty as you. She blushed under his intent gaze, but caught her lower lips between her teeth in a frown.
A lot of them did try to make love to me and got mad and drew their pay when I said no. Anyway, my last hand quit over a month ago, and my herds are melting away.
And Boxley?
He owns the XL Ranch. It's bordering on the Katy. He's been sending riders over to help me when he could spare them, but they find my fence is cut, and by the time they get a herd gathered, it's likely to be driven off before they can take it to market.
Sounds like you sure do need a man to take hold. My name's Morgan, ma'am. Most folks call me Dusty. She acknowledged his introduction with a nod, and her thoughts still on the story she was telling.
I realized a month ago that I couldn't go on like Dad wanted. It just isn't a job for a girl, or else I'm not cut out for it. And I wrote to an old friend in Colorado asking him to come and take hold. He was due on the stage from Marfa this morning, and...
Her voice broke suddenly. Dusty nodded. I know about the stage, Miss Katy. A rider come in with the news just before you drove into town. You reckon the passenger that was killed was your friend from Colorado?
He must have been. He wrote me a letter saying he'd be on that stage, and I've been pinning all my hopes on him, just living and hanging on till he got here, and now... She began to sob quietly. Dusty ached to put his arm about her shoulders and tell her the truth, but he didn't. He clamped the lines between his knees and reached in his pocket for cigarette papers and tobacco he had transferred from his shirt to Ben's when he exchanged clothing with the dead youth. He concentrated on the job of rolling a cigarette, conscious of the girl beside him, shaking with disappointment and grief. There wasn't much a man could say to her. It wouldn't help to tell her that she was just as well off with Ben Thurston dead, and if he told her what he knew about the stage hold-up, he'd have to explain why he was here like this. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want her to ever know he was hiding from a posse. The thought of telling her about Rosa and the death of the Marfa sheriff brought beads of sweat to his forehead. Right now, he felt like she was beginning to trust him, and it was a pretty wonderful thing. He got the cigarette rolled and thumbnailed a match to light it. Katie Rollins was beginning to get herself in hand. She sat up a little straighter and drew away from him and said in a choked voice, I'm sorry, it's just that I've been hoping for so much and now it's no use. I'll have to sell the ranch, though I promised Dad I never would.
A little thing like rustling, said Dusty gently, ain't no reason for selling a good ranch. If your dad run it without trouble, it can be done again.
I'm afraid it's too late for that now. Men, the sort of riders I need, avoid the KT. Word's gotten around that it's run by a girl who's afraid to stand up against rustlers.
I ain't avoiding the KT, Dusty told her.
But you can't stay.
Katie looked at him in astonishment.
I've explained why you can't.
On account of Lon Boxley?
Yeah, I can't afford to antagonize him, even if you aren't afraid of his gun.
Well, he hasn't kept the rustlers off, has he? Hasn't helped you enough, but when you're getting ready to sell the ranch.
He would, if I let him.
A flush, crimson, came to Katie's tanned cheeks, but she met Dusty's inquiring gaze without flinching. He wants to marry you, huh?
He hasn't asked me, but I know he does.
He's 10 years older than you, Dusty broke out hotly. Katie met his outburst with a wan smile.
I'm not going to marry him, she assured him, not even to save the ranch.
Ma'am, let me take a hand in the game.
You haven't explained how you came to be in Hermosa this morning afoot.
Oh, that. My horse had an accident down the road a piece. A rattler got him.
You're a fugitive, aren't you? Riding what men call the Owl Hoot Trail.
Dusty's jaw hardened. Why do you guess that?
Most men who come to Hermosa, and you seemed awfully ready with your gun. You would have killed Lon, wouldn't you, if I hadn't called out and stopped you?
He deserved killing, shooting from behind like that.
He was crazy mad. You'd knocked him down in front of me and in front of his men.
Well, he had it coming.
You frightened me, said Katie simply, when you look like you do now, as you looked when you drew on Lon. I don't see why men have to fight and kill each other, she cried out wildly. There's a lust for killing that gets into their blood. I've seen it here on the border, and too much of it, and that's why I forbade my riders to go armed.
And got overrun by rustlers, Dusty reminded her.
All right, sometimes I'm sorry. I've avoided bloodshed that way. Perhaps I've saved some man from turning into a killer.
But now there's bound to be killing, no matter who takes over the ranch. The rustlers won't quit without being persuaded by lead now that they've started.
Oh, I don't know, Katie cried out brokenly. I just don't know. I wanted to do what was right. I wanted to run the ranch peacefully.
Well, you picked the wrong place for that, I reckon. You'd better trade the KT for a farm back in Kansas. There was a bit of a lashing scorn in Dusty's voice. Katie looked at him wonderingly.
You sound like all the other men who've quit for me.
Sure, I'd have quit too.
But you're offering to help me.
Because I thought you wanted a man that would use his guns.
I do, she said suddenly. I'm through with being faint-hearted. I'll fight those rustlers back. I won't let them ruin the KC.
The sharp line of rim rock swung sharply to the left in front of them, and at the same time the line of cottonwoods marked the bank of the river swerving to the right in a great sweeping arc to form a wide spread between the river and the cliffs. Katie said,
There it is,
quietly, but with a tremor of pride in her young voice. Dusty stared speechlessly ahead at the wide sweep of the flat land that lay before them. It was a rich, plain, perfectly flat, stretching ahead as far as the eye could see, covered with green grass and dotted with mesquite and catclaw. It looked more like pictures of an English meadow than anything Dusty Morgan had ever seen or dreamed of seeing in the West. The road cut straight ahead through the rich grass, and the palominos lifted their heads and snorted as though to welcome the sight and smell of the unbelievably rich pasture land. Dusty said, "It's like riding into paradise out of hell. Begging your pardon, Miss Katy." His voice was low and with awe. Katy nodded, her brown eyes shining mistily.
"I feel the same way even now, after living here all my life. Do you now see why I don't want to give up on the KT?" she demanded fiercely.
"Any man would sell his soul for a piece like this, ma'am." Dusty's eyes were going hungrily from side to side, feasting themselves on the sight of the slick, stocky steers gazing knee-deep in the rich herbage.
"It's a strip that's 18 miles long and 8 miles in width at the widest point. There's a little over 60 sections in all. The whole flat used to be riverbed, Dad said, thousands of years ago. And then the river cut the course it now follows. There's more than 300 springs altogether, and they never dry up. It stays green like this all summer, and it'll support 1,000 head with plenty of winter feed without cutting and stacking."
Dusty's silence was the finest tribute he could pay to her brief description of the KT Ranch. It was the kind of spot cattlemen in the arid West dreamt about after drinking too heavily on a Saturday night.
"It's only about half grazed now," Katy said in a low voice. "There were 800 head on the ranch when Dad died, and the rustlers picked out the best of my stock every time they make a raid."
"It ain't surprising you got rustlers," Dusty muttered. 18 miles of riverbank on one side. All they got to do is push 'em across and cut out whatever they want. Funny thing to me is that your daddy ever kept any stock long enough to get 'em to market."
"It isn't all bad," Katy explained. "The river all along here has a quicksand bottom. There's only 3 fords in the entire 18 miles where a man can ride across without bogging down. We've got it all fenced, of course, to keep the stock out."
"Only 3 fords?" Dusty's eyes lightened. 3 men could guard them easy enough."
"I don't know," Katy responded hopelessly. "I had men guarding the fords, and the rustling went on. Yet we know there's no other places the river can be forded."
Directly ahead of the buckboard, rising magically out of the grassy flat, was a large group of trees, cottonwoods, poplars, and weeping willows.
"That's the home place,"
Katy told him, nodding towards the seeming mirage.
"The main spring is there. Dad built the house himself more than 30 years ago. He homesteaded that section and leased the rest of it, and he'd been buying it up steadily ever since. He paid out the last section 2 years before he died."
The team was straining against the bit now, eager to finish the journey in the tree shade and quiet spot that was home. Dusty let them into a fast trot. His eyes narrowed as he took in the long, rambling buildings of rough limestone block and the shades of the giant cottonwoods at the upper end of the oasis, the huge pond surrounded by weeping willows and the double line of straight poplars leading down to the sheds and corrals a couple 100 yards distant beyond the main house. A few white leghorn chickens scratching idly in the yard, and a Jersey milk cow munching her cud in a wire corral, watching them drive up. There was no other sign of life about the place. Over it brooded an atmosphere of melancholy and desertion that was somehow evil in essence. It was planned and built for peace and serenity, for the heart-warming quietude that comes with security and freedom from care and want. But this was different. It seemed to be peopled with ghosts, and the chill that struck Dusty Morgan's heart was colder then could be occasioned by a mere shade of trees overhead as he pulled the buckboard up in the yard. He looked at Katy, and saw that she had become subdued and listless. He cramped the wheel for her over, and she stepped down, saying quietly,
"I'll go into the house and tell Juanita to start some dinner. I think you'll find Miguel around the barn. They're the only ones left. Come up to the house after you've unharnessed, and I'll see about furnishing you a horse so you can ride out."
She turned away from the buckboard and went slowly towards the stone ranch house. Dusty had to bite his lips to keep from crying out and telling her that he had no intentions of riding on. He had come to the end of the trail, and he knew it. End of chapter 8.